Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at an introduction to CSS, and specifically, we are going to focus on inline styling in your HTML document. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other technologies as they relate to intranet and internet development. In this video, we are going to focus on inline styling. So the first thing that we want to remind ourselves of is the HTML style attribute that is available in most of the HTML tags. The reason I say it that way is that in some cases the style element is available. However, the behavior is poorly defined or undefined. We're going to focus in on some very basic examples that will allow for us to modify the appearance of an HTML tag. So in other words, in earlier examples, we had our P tag or one of our H1 through H6 tags that may have had some text in it, but we really didn't have a great way to modify the appearance of that text. Of course, we could put in the explanation or an example of hello world or something along those lines. However, though, we were limited to whatever font was the default in the web browser. And unless we had changed that, it would be a black font color, as well as the default size. Instead, what we want to do is we want to leverage this HTML style attribute. And from there, we can modify the color, the size, the type of font that would be used for a given element. Now, it turns out there's many, many more things that we can modify, background color, and a number of other things, but we'll start with that. And so to begin with, go ahead and take a look at the HTML style attribute page, as well as under the CSS tutorial. We want to remind ourselves real quick of the list of CSS properties. And so these are all of the different properties that we could technically modify using an appropriate style attribute for an appropriate HTML tag. But another way, not every one of the tags are going to behave with every one of the properties. So in some cases, it might be a little bit of trial and error for you to figure out what the patterns are. Now, to begin with, let's go ahead and start off with another blank HTML document. Again, we're going to focus mainly on the CSS or the style inline version of it. So we'll go ahead and name this document appropriately. So this will be our CSS inline or style inline, as well as including an H1 tag. Again, this is just mainly for us to be able to keep track of all of the examples that we have done so far. I'm going to go ahead and split my view, and you can see here now I have my ability to update the design view as I start adding elements in the body. Now, let's start off with a simple one. We'll go ahead and take a look at a P tag. And what we'll do is we'll start with the style attribute. And you'll notice here with Visual Studio is that it automatically populates with all of the different possible valid CSS components that we can use. And so you can see here with the style, we have all sorts of different possibilities. We can scroll down into the fonts. Let's go ahead and start typing here. So font, you'll see I've got the font display, the font family, font size, and so on. Okay. We can also do things like we can modify the background. We can look at the background color for the P tag. And again, there's quite a few options, again, that we can go through. Most of these are listed on the documentation for the W3 schools. We're going to start with a simple example here, and that we're just simply going to attempt to modify the font. And so we'll go with a font size. So we'll specify the font size. That is the property. The value that we're interested in, let's say that we wanted to make the font much larger. So I'm going to go ahead and specify 100 pixels. And then we'll just use the classic example of hello world. And there you go. Now you can see that our text that we just entered has a forced size of 100 pixels, which is far larger than our H1 tag's default would be. We can continue with this example here. We'll just do a couple of these. So let's do a little bit of copy and paste here. Let's change, instead of the font size, how about if we change something about the color of the font? And so if we specify the color, you'll see that with Visual Studio, we have a couple of predefined examples, and then we can also enter in value using an RGB function. But for right now, what we'll do is we'll just pick some examples here, and I'm going to have some fun with this, so I apologize if this turns out quite ugly looking. I encourage you to do the same thing, that you can just play around with the different options. And so you can see there I have a much smaller hello world down there in the bottom. Again, now I've reverted back to whatever the default font size would be for the document. In this case, it's going to be 12 pixels. This is probably a little too large here, so let's drop this down to 50. And again, the whole purpose is just to have some examples here. Now, in addition to that, we can also modify some things like the background associated with the P tag. So again, I'm going to go ahead and specify the style, and we'll specify the background color. You can do things like the blend mode. You can, of course, as we saw in an earlier video, you can actually add an image to the background. In this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to specify the color. And again, just to pick another example, hopefully it won't be too hard on the eyes, we'll go with coral. And again, we'll do another hello world. And that actually looks pretty bad. I'm having some fun with this. I encourage you to do the same here. So I'm just going to pick random colors that I may not have necessarily worked with before. Now, you're probably wondering, can I do multiple things to a single element? The answer is absolutely yes, you can. And so what we'll do is we'll again do another P tag. And again, I've just picked on this particular tag because it's easy for us to create a couple of these. How about if we modify or combine rather a couple of things? We'll go with our font size. We'll go with maybe slightly smaller font, 36 pixels. But then what we want to do is we also want to specify a different color. So you'll notice here that I have a semicolon separating the different attributes here. And so we'll go here with the color. And again, we'll pick some interesting background here. So let's go with the dark red. And again, in addition to the color of the font, you can also specify the background color of the P tag in and of itself. And this is probably going to look pretty rough, but we're going to go ahead and include here aqua. And this last semicolon is technically optional. I do encourage you to consider to be in the habit of putting it in there. It does not affect the ability for the page to render. And then lastly, we need to put some more text here. And there you go. So again, you can see how you would go about directly adding style to a individual element. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to jump really quick to another example within this first example. This is going to pretty much follow the same pattern, whether you're using the P tags, tables, lists, and so on. Just the behavior might change. And so we're going to jump around just a little bit. I think you can guess that you can probably pretty easily modify, for instance, the H1 tag here. We'll just specify style. And again, we'll stick with the color because that's the easiest one for us to see. And again, we'll just pick some interesting color here. It's going to stand out, maybe a dark green. And you can see, there you go. Now that now we have our header has a dark green coloration to it. And then we can also do the same thing with the body itself. So we can come up here now that you see the pattern, and we can just change the style of the entire body. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to change the background color. And let's see what we can come up with here that won't be too bad. Maybe go down a little further. Let's try the royal blue. And you can see here, that now everything related to the background of the body is now this royal blue. However, you'll notice that the P tag that we changed the background color to, whether it be coral or later on to aqua, still retains that color. So in other words, that's where the hierarchical nature of styling comes into play, because effectively the P tag style overrides the body's style. And again, just to be sure that this is actually displaying correctly, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's go ahead and name this one CSS_inline as our first example of styling. And what we can do is we can go out to our web browser now, and we can see that sure enough, it renders pretty much the same way that it does in Visual Studio. As a matter of fact, I don't see any immediate differences between the two rendering. Now, keep in mind now, this is the styling. The structure of the document hasn't really changed any from what we were doing earlier. It's still nothing more than a body with an H1 tag followed by a couple of P tags. It's just now that we have some style associated with it. I encourage you to perhaps pause the video here for a little bit and just play around with it, see what you can come up with. Get familiar with perhaps some of the other attributes that you could change using style. Now, and for our second example for this video, I'm going to jump to something a little more sophisticated, but something that we can already sort of appreciate the difficulty or the problems associated with styling inline. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our table example. I'm going to keep this table relatively simple. In other words, I'm not going to bother with having a head, a body, and a foot. I'm just going to use the simplified structure, and that is going to be to have a table row and maybe just 2 columns, nothing too sophisticated. And what we'll do is we'll probably end up having about 3 or 4 rows. So this is going to be our column 1. So row 1, column 1, and then this, of course, the one below it is going to be row 1, column 2. And there's a reason why I'm taking a second to make this kind of painful example here manually, and you'll see why in just a second. And you can see there hidden in the blue is our row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2. And again, you would agree that it's kind of hard to read. Now, in our previous example, what we would have done is we went to the table itself, table tag, and we would have just simply specified border. Instead, what we'd like to do is we'd like to now fully embrace the style. And what we'll do here is we'll say style equals, and we'll say border. And we'll specify, in this case, double. It doesn't really matter. Again, give you an opportunity to play around with it a little bit. But you'll see now the entire table has a border around it. And you'll notice that there is no border between the individual columns. And to really highlight that, I'm going to go ahead and copy the row that we just created. Again, I'm going to change this to row 2. And you'll notice that now this table sort of looks a little strange, if you would. In other words, it's encapsulated by a border. And in this case, this is where you have to learn to understand the behavior of the styling. Literally, we are styling just the table itself, not the individual elements. And so what we want to do is learn now how to style the individual cells in the table. So we can go into the TD and we can specify a separate style. And again, we'll say style equals. We're going to focus again on the border, and maybe let's do a different one. Let's do a dashed border. Again, this probably doesn't look all that great. I am just having some fun with it here. If anything, it's really trying to highlight what we're doing here. And you can see there that we've got a dashed border around each one of the cells. I can, again, go through and just simply add that to each of the additional cells. And, again, you can see here, we're getting a rather ugly looking table here. Try to make it a little larger here so you can see it. And then we'll do this one more time here, just so you can see how this would transfer forward or carry forward. And then what we want to do is we want to do an additional change here. So I'm going to go ahead real quick before I forget. I'm going to change this to row 3. And I'll tell you what, before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and do row 4. So the idea now I have a couple of odd numbered rows and a couple of even numbered rows. And you can probably guess where I'm going with this. And the idea is that I would like to style each of the rows differently. And you've probably seen a website where there was a subtle difference between adjacent rows. Makes the website look a little easier to read, makes it a little more aesthetically pleasing. And again, that's kind of the goal behind this. And then what we'll do is we'll come in here, we'll actually style the individual rows based on whether they are even or odd. And so what we'll do here is, in this case, we'll go with our background color. And for a little bit of variety here, why don't we pick something brown? And again, you can see here now that the first row is a brown color. And the idea here is that I want to also have the third row be brown. And then for the second and fourth row, or the even rows, maybe I want to go with a different color. Let's see what our options are. And again, let's have some fun with this. That one looks pretty rough there. Let's try that. I think we can do better than that. Again, I'm also having some fun with this, trying to encourage you to do the same. There we go. There we go. That should really stand out. And then what we would do here is we would copy and paste this down here to the fourth row. And again, let's go ahead and save this. Let's come out to our web browser, hit refresh. And you can see that we have a pretty shockingly ugly table. And again, that's kind of the point, is to have a little bit of fun with it, enjoy this, have some fun with the colorations. However, we also want to focus on the reason that we would do something like this, or rather the reason that we wouldn't want to do something like this. And again, much like I do in my other courses, I can spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes explaining why something is a bad idea, or I can just simply do it once. And you would agree that if we had to go through and manually make these additions to every single one of the cells and every single one of the rows, particularly if our client comes back and says that they do not want fuchsia, or they do not want that particular color of brown, and then you would either have to do a selective Control H, find and replace, be very careful that you didn't change it in other areas of the page, or you would have to go through and manually edit all of the cell styling. Again, I think you can quickly see why there's a limitation with inline styling. It's great for putting something together quickly, gets the idea across. Long-term sustainable, it is definitely not. So I'm going to leave this video here. Hopefully you found this useful. And again, I would encourage you to play around with some of the other elements, whether it's the lists, the tables, the div tags, span tags for that matter. Pretty much all of the tags that we have explored so far have the ability to get styled. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at additional examples in later videos. Hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.